Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of the Beyond the Finish Line podcast. Today, I'm interviewing Ed Baker, who is the Chief Product Officer at Whoop. And in 1999, while on the track team at Harvard, Ed launched datesite.com, which is the original Tinder. He'll explain what it is in the episode, and achieved almost half of the campus using this application, which was really a web-based application, within a week, which is remarkable. And Ed went on in his career to launch multiple products and companies, heading up growth at Facebook under Zuckerberg, at Uber, and eventually he created a company and sold it to Whoop, where he's at today. Ed also has a family. He ran in the Olympic trials for the marathon, went to the Stanford Business School, and best of all, he is incredibly humble. I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Ed Baker. Ed Baker, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's great to see you here.
Great to be here, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So let's kick it off with a couple of rapid fire questions to get to know you before we get into the interview.
Okay.
That work?
Sounds good.
All right. It's going to be 9. It'll only take 3 minutes though. So
Okay.
What's the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning?
Have a coffee, then work out. I guess that's 2 things.
Nice. No, that works. What's your go-to comfort food?
Ooh, go-to comfort food. The first thing that popped in my head, I don't know if it's comfort food, but I really like sushi a lot.
That's great. It is a healthier comfort food, so that's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Can you name a book that has significantly impacted your life?
Yeah, there's this one book called Predictably Irrational, which is all about how humans are irrational, but in predictable ways. And it's a great read. I find I use things I learned from that book day to day in the work that I do. And so that's a pretty interesting one.
Awesome. Okay, noted. If you could teleport to any place in the world right now, where would it be?
I guess Japan, so I could have some good sushi. No, I actually do love Japan as well. I've lived there a few different times in my life. Starting off in high school, spent some summers abroad in Japan.
That's really cool. Do you speak Japanese?
I speak a bit.
And
I'm
also
rusty now. What's that?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you also speak Mandarin, right?
I speak some Mandarin as well. I think my Japanese is better than my Mandarin, but my kids actually speak fluent Mandarin, so they make fun of my accent.
That's awesome. Okay, what's the one mental model or frame of thinking that if you didn't learn, you'd probably be less happy, less fulfilled, and slower in life?
Oh, you know what? There was something my dad told me when I was a kid that I really have found to be true, which is things are never as bad as they seem and they're never as good as they seem. So I think it's a good reminder that, when you're feeling down, hey, it's not actually as bad as you think it is. And when you're feeling great, also keep in mind, like, it's probably not as great as you think it is either.
Yeah, the emotions, they yank you in either direction. That's good.
Especially doing startups, you got to get used to that roller coaster, ups and downs every single day.
Yeah, that seems pretty stoic. I'm pretty sure, Marcus Aurelius, one of those guys, said, keep the emotions under control because like your dad said, it's never as good as it seems.
Totally.
Okay, cool. 3 more. If you hadn't pursued track, I don't know if, your parents made you get into the sport as a kid or you just decided, I'm not going to pursue this. Would your life look that much different?
I think it would, but I think I would have pursued a different sport most likely. Part of me actually somewhat regrets I didn't try a few other endurance sports when I was younger, in particular rowing. I feel like that would have been a pretty interesting one to learn when I was younger. But I'd say, like, if I hadn't pursued any sports at all, it would definitely be different. We can get into this later if you want to, but I feel like track and running has really impacted me in kind of the rest of my life and in the business that I do. Just a lot of the things I learned as a runner.
That's great to hear because that's exactly what this podcast is about. So talking to people who use their learnings in athletics to help drive career success. Okay, two more. What
Okay.
famous person or historical figure would you have lunch with if you could?
Is it all right if I pick someone who's not famous?
Yeah, you just got to explain why.
Okay. I never met my paternal grandfather. Um, and my dad often tells me that I remind him a lot of his own dad. And I wish I had had a chance to meet him in person. So I think that's who I'd have lunch with.
That's as good of an answer as it gets. And the last one, what's the kindest thing anyone has ever done for you? Yes, you may have heard that on Patrick O'Shaughnessy's podcast.
um, my wife marrying me.
That's awesome. That's the same answer I got from another person who came on the
Oh, really?
show. Yeah, from
Well, I mean,
Duke
not just
Rolean. Yeah,
marrying me, but like raising four kids with me and really off, she does the heavy lifting in our family. So I don't know where I'd be without her.
that's awesome. Okay, sweet. That was great. Now I feel like I know you a little bit better. Let's get into it. So I have a little blurb to read here. And Ed, you've seen it all, at least from my perspective. You ran track at Harvard while studying chemistry and physics and finishing magna cum laude. You started not one, not two, not three, but four companies that got acquired. One of them was acquired by Facebook in 2011, where you were brought in by Zuck to run international growth for a few years. You ran product at Uber in growth. You were an early investor in Lyman Swift. You started another company, sold it to Whoop. This this resume is insane. So that left out that you went to Stanford GSB, and when you were there, you graduated in RJ Miller, which is top 10% of the class, I think. And while you were there, you also ran a 2:21 in the marathon, qualifying for the Olympic trials.
You make me
Dude,
sound more impressive than I think I am, but thank you.
and you're humble. Come on. What did you eat growing up? Who made you who you are?
Who made me who I am? Gosh, I think ever since I was a kid, I always just had a bit of this competitive streak in me and wanted to just see like what I was capable of. Um, and I think I often like felt most uh, felt most competitive when people didn't believe in me a little bit, and I kind of wanted to like prove that I could do things that maybe other people didn't think I could do.
That's some serious underlying competitiveness. I feel like I have the same thing. How do you define success? Because all of these different companies, you've exited companies, you qualified for, the marathon Olympic trials, you ran track at Harvard. The bar must keep changing, but how do you define success?
Good question. I'd say the way I like to think about it is, can I improve myself versus like where I've been so far? Can I make an improvement? I like to define it relative to myself rather than relative to other people. So I remember when I was um, getting into triathlons and did my first Ironman race, my coach at the time said, "You're really just you're racing against yourself. You're not racing against the other people in the race." And so that is something I've liked about the sports I've done, these endurance sports. You can, when you're measuring your time to complete a certain distance, you can always try to beat yourself.
If you're in a field and you're racing a bunch of people, does winning against those people matter less than winning against yourself?
Well, winning's obviously great, but I think the way you get to become a winner is if you keep beating yourself, eventually you'll beat other people as well.
Yeah.
So, when I started out as a runner in middle school, I definitely I wasn't beating most people. I still remember the first day that I went out for cross country practice, and I, I think I was the slowest person on the team. And I, it's a funny story. Like we did our warm up. I thought that was the practice. We jogged about a mile over to a nearby park, and we stopped. And I thought, oh, we're done. And the coach said, okay, now we're going to stretch, and let's do the stretching routine, and then I'll tell everyone what the workout is. And I was like, that's when I realized, like, whoa, we still have more to go. And then the coach said to me, Ed, why don't you run with the girls today? See if you can kind of hang on the back of the pack and you know go from there. And so that's where I started out in seventh grade when I had my first cross country practice the summer before I started seventh grade.
And when did you? That's also I joined the cross country team at the same time, and I was
Oh
also
yeah.
very slow, and I was pretty chunky at the time. It
Okay.
helped me get in shape. But
Yeah.
is that what you were running with the girls? He said, just try to hang on the back of the pack. There is that kind of what that flipped the switch in your competitive brain, and it was just like, come on, dude.
A little bit, but I don't know. At the time, I was like, "Gosh, I hope I can hang on to the back of the pack here." And I think that first day, like that's basically where I was. But I was just glad that I didn't get completely dropped,
Yeah.
And then I think I realized I kept showing up to practice. I was like, "Okay, that's a place to start," and I slowly moved my way up. But again, it was kind of like I always told myself I can do better than what I did before. Again, it was like more of a relative to myself and my past performance, more so than trying to always compare myself to other people.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I did not have the maturity of mind, I don't think. It's actually only been very recent where I've had that kick in the pants. It said like
Yeah.
stop comparing yourself. I think the quote is like don't worry about what's happening to other people, worry about what you can do. But that's awesome you got that at a young age. So what
Well,
could you
I'm
do?
I mean, I'm sure I was also like thinking about other people. So I don't mean to say like back when I was 13 years old, I was like, oh, I don't care about any of this other stuff. No, I did. But I think at the time I just didn't really know what to expect. And
Hmm.
um, I had also played JV tennis, and I was like not a very good tennis player. And so I think I just like wasn't thinking that I would like ultimately, by my junior year in high school, I was captain of the cross country team and had really set the school record in the mile. And so, I did not see myself accomplishing those things when I first joined the team as a seventh grader.
So you have to stick with it over that period of time to get or to become better. What were the things that you were focused on and what kept you, sticking with it? Was it just like, wow, I like this activity, or it's wow, I see a huge opportunity for myself to improve here, or
Yeah,
something
I
else?
think it's more the latter than the
Yeah.
former. Like it's actually not until it wasn't until much later in life that I started to kind of enjoy going on runs. I did not like run. People always used to say to me, "Oh, you must love running. How do you love running? Like running's so awful." And I was like, "No, I don't love running. I actually really don't like running at all." Throughout high school and college,
It's
it
painful.
wasn't something I enjoyed, but
Yeah.
I what I did enjoy was improving and getting better and ultimately winning, races and that kind of thing. And I realized the way I do that is by putting in the work and running more. And so I think what motivated me back then, again, it was like a pretty simple formula. It's like the more you put in, the more you get out. And just being able to constantly like just to see that like this is the path to improvement. And
Hmm.
running again is a sport where like you can time yourself over a given distance and you can know objectively, am I getting faster or not? I think
Yeah.
with other sports, it's maybe not quite as easy to measure those little improvements. I know as a swimmer, you can probably relate to this, but like
Yeah.
every fraction of a second can make a difference, and you can measure your improvement.
Yeah. That's awesome. And I got to ask before we move into your experience at Harvard, why did you choose Harvard over Stanford?
Well, I applied to both schools, and I was accepted to both schools and visited both schools, but
Hated the sun.
Yeah, I hated the sun. Actually, I grew up in Palo Alto until I was 13, and then we moved to
Okay.
Florida. So Stanford was kind of in my backyard
Mm,
for many years, and I always got excited thinking about the possibility of ending up there in college. But ironically, running had something to do with it. I remember the Harvard coach was, I was talking to him pretty frequently, and he was actively recruiting me to come to Harvard. Whereas the Stanford coach, the one time I spoke with him, I was actually out at Stanford visiting the school, and I briefly met with him, and he said, "Yeah, your mile time of 4:23 is okay, but it would be a lot more exciting if it was a 4:13." And so he just like wasn't interested in recruiting me. Like I wasn't even sure if I'd be able to run if I went to Stanford. And so that was part of it. I think the other part was I'd never lived on the East Coast, and thought that spending some time in Cambridge would be interesting, and it felt like something I should do.
okay, got it. And did you know that you wanted to major in sciencey stuff when you went to school?
I always loved math and science. I thought I might major in math, but after my first math class at Harvard, I realized like I was more into physics and chemistry than I was math. So,
The
but I knew it
applied
would be
math.
something in kind of the math and science space.
Okay, got it. And I got to ask how you manage your time. I know the first couple of years at Harvard, you were running, like, those are not easy majors. Was this a double major in
I
chem and physics?
at Harvard they called it. It wasn't like a double major. It was actually its own concentration was called chemistry and physics.
Okay.
So it was like a single major covering those both of those topics.
Okay. Either way, it doesn't sound easy. I was pre med and took some of the chem classes and some of the physics classes, but I can't
Yeah.
imagine having to swim and go and do these problem sets for homework that were so computationally intensive that I was just like, oh my god, I'm not going to get any sleep. So how did you manage your time?
Um, you know, what's funny is that I initially thought, gosh, running on the track team and cross country team and doing the schoolwork, it's going to like not give me as much time to get the work done. And when we would have like 1 or 2 weeks off between cross country and indoor track season, for example, I thought, oh, I'll get so much more done during those 2 weeks that I don't have to go to practice. And surprisingly, it was the opposite. I procrastinated more. I stayed up later. And what I realized after my first year experiencing that was running or having that sport and having kind of the routine. It forced me to be more efficient with my time, and I was more productive during the hours that I wasn't at practice. And so kind of having those constraints and that more of that structured schedule, like ended up being a good thing for me. And
It,
so, yeah, I don't know if you saw the same thing when you were swimming in college, like kind of having that routine, I found it helped.
Yeah. Well, the next question is, did you use, like, when you found times where you were less productive over time, or maybe you didn't because you knew that about yourself so early? Did you say, I got to add more to my schedule here? Uh,
Right.
so, so when you were, post college, did you just
Yeah.
say, okay, how do I fill my time? I got to do more.
Yeah, I think if you were to talk to my wife, she'd say that I tend to be someone who just kind of keeps adding things into my schedule until there's like no room to add anything else. So I think my nature is just to fill um, any time I have with new things. And I tend to be the most restless when I'm on vacation, like sitting on the beach. I think I look forward to it, and then after a day or two on the beach, I'm like, okay, I gotta like get back to doing something.
Yeah. And so how do you like figure out what those new things are? Do you have like this laundry list of interests, or like, I want to fly a plane one day, or, I want to go and see if I can start a company in this space? How do you prioritize what the new things that you try are? Or do they kind of come at you and you're like, yeah, I'll slot that in?
they kind of come at me. I wouldn't say that I'm great at like sitting back and saying of the hundreds of things I could be doing, I'm going to make a big list and prioritize and all of that. It's more just kind of things that I just happen to discover. So, like back when I was living in the Bay Area, several of my friends got into kiteboarding, and I took some kiteboarding lessons and really got into that. And for a while, that was like my main hobby. More recently, I've been trying to learn how to wing foil. So I guess, there's the stuff like that. I'd say one thing that's always been a part of my life is endurance sports. So it hasn't always been running. It was running in high school and in college, and for a few years after college, I got into the marathon and um, ran pretty competitively for a few years after college. But then in more recent years, I got into triathlon for a few years. I got into rowing and cross country skiing, and I just find that for me, the endurance sports kind of almost doesn't matter which one it is, and I like mixing it up. But I find that I feel better, I sleep better. I find if I just at least get some sort of cardio in every morning.
Yeah. Okay. And you're not talking just some cardio. Like your runs are probably 2 hours long in the morning, right? Like you hit it
Some mornings,
hard.
not definitely not every morning, but
Yeah.
I have been this past year. I've gotten back into running. Um, in fact, it was the first time in 17 years that I ran a marathon. This past April, I ran the
Where'd you
Boston
go?
Marathon.
What was your time?
Um, my time was 2:32. Uh, which actually it beat my Boston PR by 1 minute from like 20 years ago. It was the last time I ran the Boston Marathon, I think.
Wow.
So I felt pretty good with the 2:32. I was hoping I could break 2:30, but I'd forgotten how difficult of a course Boston is.
Oh,
All of the
I know nothing
downhill
about
and
it.
then hitting Heartbreak Hill. It was a warmer day, so it really beat me up, but I was still
It's,
happy with the time overall.
the cool thing about this conversation is like I feel like I can talk to you about sports at the, most detailed level, but you're running growth right now at Whoop and you have this amazing career happening and rewinding that back to Harvard. I got a question for you.
All right.
You co-founded when you were at school datesite.com.
Oh yeah, datesite.com.
That's the original Facebook, is it not? This was the
Oh,
idea that Zuck ripped off of eventually when he
I
created
wish
Facebook, right?
I wish I could agree with you there. I mean, it definitely wasn't it definitely wasn't Facebook, but it was like a pretty fun thing that I built back when we were in college. My roommates and I built this website that was basically a crush site where you could put in email addresses of people you had a crush on. They'd get an email saying somebody likes you, and then if two people put each other's email addresses in, it would match them up. So it
The
was actually
original
kind of like,
swipe.
yeah, it was like Tinder or Bumble, but with email addresses instead of photos.
Yeah.
Um, and it went viral on campus within 1 week. We launched it my sophomore year, 1999. And within 1 week of launch, a quarter of all the students at Harvard had signed up for it. So that was kind of my first taste of building something that grew exponentially and virally online.
What went through your head at that time? You're like, holy crap, I can make money. Should I drop out of school? What do I need to build a team? Do I
Yeah,
innovate user experience here? What do I do?
I think the first thing that went through my head was like, wow, this is powerful to be able to build something that can grow exponentially online and
Mhm.
kind of grow on its own. And since I was studying physics at the time, I was also kind of intrigued by the exponential growth. Um, and some of my close friends uh, were kind of saw that, and they built another app that started to grow in a viral way, and they were also studying physics. And we kind of like a few of us figured out that hey, there's this way to measure virality online, and there's a framework you can use to basically measure the K factor start doing A/B tests to get that K factor above 1. And once it gets above 1, you can have explosive exponential growth. Uh, and back in 1999, like no one really knew about that. And even for the next, I'd say for like the next decade, it was still kind of like this secret that a handful of us kind of knew about, and we didn't really want to like share it with everyone else. And then I think it was Andrew Chen who started blogging about it finally. It was probably in like 2007, 2008. Um, and those of us who knew about it were like, oh no, now everyone's going to know how to do it. But one thing we realized was, even once it started being talked about more and everyone knew like, oh, you can measure this thing called the K factor. And if you get your K factor above 1, you can grow exponentially. Um, the hard part was the art more than the science, right? So the art behind, how do you get a K factor above 1? By the way, I keep throwing out the term K factor. It basically just means like, for every user who signs up, how many new users do they bring on? So
Yeah.
if you have a K factor of 2, that means like one person signs up, they get 2 friends on, those 2 friends get 4 friends on. 2 means it's doubling each time. I don't know if
Where's
I've
the
ever
K
seen.
come from?
Good question. I'm not actually sure what the K stands for. I think that's
Okay.
just kind of what's often used as a
Yeah.
variable when you're referring to the exponent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so, but by the way, you like never, I don't think you ever see a K factor of 2. Even a K factor of like 1.4 is huge,
Yeah.
and can allow you to grow to millions of users in a matter of months or even weeks.
So now getting the K factor to 1 is way more challenging because there's more competition, because it's easier to stand up tools. It's easier to get or to spend money on Instagram, Facebook, whatever it is, to make stuff go viral.
That's
What
right.
is the secret that you now know about making stuff go viral that you hope Andrew Chen doesn't write about in 7 years from now? So
Well,
I can delete
it
this from the
definitely.
podcast, but I got to use it for my own
Oh,
stuff.
okay, okay, yeah. So I'll tell you all the secrets, then delete it. No, just joking.
Perfect.
What I'll say is like, it's actually really hard these days to get a K factor above 1
Yeah.
for anything, for all the reasons you mentioned, but also just the fact that like people these days are much less likely to respond to things like an email that says somebody likes you, right? That'll
Mm,
probably be caught in a spam filter, or if it's not caught in a spam filter, you're probably not going to click on it and sign up,
yeah.
right? So that's one big difference today versus 1999, when people like would read every email that came to them, and if
Mm,
it said someone likes you, they probably would be like, oh, this must be legit, I'm going to click on it.
yeah.
So I'd say that's one thing that's changed, is just like the channels to deliver these like invites are just not nearly as effective. Um,
Got it.
in terms of like what does work today, if that stuff doesn't work, I'd come back to it being more of an art than a science. And also, I think these days, like the products that grow the fastest tend to be the products that actually are really good products with strong product market fit, right? If there's a product that people genuinely love to use and use frequently, then they're more likely to share it with their friends. And so, that was part of the reason I ended up going to both Facebook and Uber and now Whoop, is I feel like in all 3 of those cases, those were products that clearly have a great product market fit, right? And high retention. So one thing with high retention is, if someone's coming back and using a product frequently, like every day, there are just so many more opportunities for them to tell their friends about it. So you might not have a K factor of above 1 in a 24-hour period, but if you use Whoop over the course of a year, you might tell, let's say you tell one friend a month about Whoop. Over a 12-month period, you've told 12 friends. And if, 1 or 2 of those friends actually sign up and get Whoop, then they can like use it for 12 months and tell, some of their friends. So that's where you get the virality. It's like less of a every 24 hours you're
Mhm.
growing, but it's kind of like over a longer time period. But that
Yeah.
only works for the products where people use them for a longer time period. So like a crush site, you might only use once or twice. Well, I guess these days with the apps, people are using them a lot more than that. But like the one I built at Harvard, people use it once or twice and then not come back.
Yeah, well, the primary goal for most people on these apps is likely, hey, find someone. I want to find
Right.
someone. So
Right.
it's almost like your goal is to get off of the platform as
That's
fast
right.
as possible.
That's right.
But with tools like Whoop and anything that's fitness based, it's benefiting you to use it over time. So
Right.
engagement is very important. You need to get product market fit through not only adoption but that next hurdle, which is can you be consistent with it over a period of time. And I like Whoop because you have that score, and I think we've talked about that before, where it
Right.
tells me here's my score overnight, and then you have people like Brian Johnson, the most studied human of all time, who's advertising for free Whoop because he's like, hey, look, I got 100 sleep scores 6 months in
Yeah.
a row, and it's like, well, how
Totally.
do I do that? So it
Right.
seems like,
Right.
yeah, this how much time it takes to do that is it's
Sure.
different for these consistency based tools. But how
That's
do
right.
you drive that engagement besides just a score?
Well, the recovery score, I think is a pretty important piece of it. It's the first thing I do every morning as my wife and I both, we wake up and check our recovery scores and we ask each other, hey, how's your score? How's your score? Are you green, yellow, or red?
Yeah,
It's like our daily morning ritual. In fact, that's how I probably should have answered the question, what's the first thing you do every morning? Because I do tend to
sure.
check my Whoop recovery score before I make my coffee. um,
Yeah, nice.
so that's part of it, but I think it's also just getting into the habit of not just checking in the morning how's your recovery score, but if you're doing an activity during the day, whether it's like a bike ride or a swim or a run or whatever it is, Whoop also records that, and you can kind of measure your strain from that. And also, in addition to looking at a recovery score every morning, I like to see my sleep stats. So, uh, one of the things I'll do every morning is look at how much restorative sleep did I get? How many hours of restorative sleep? And restorative sleep is a combination of your deep sleep and your REM sleep.
Hmm.
And usually I get between 3 and 4 hours of
Hmm.
restorative sleep. So I feel really good if I get somewhere in that range.
That
Um,
that was going to be my exact question, the feeling part. So I use this tool. I was training in Arizona with a swim group in 2015. So Whoop was early days, and we used that tool. And I was getting these Whoop scores, and it would say, you scored a 92 or a 93. I slept for 8 hours or something like that, but I felt like crap.
yeah,
And sometimes it said you got a 63, and I
yeah,
felt incredible.
yeah,
So I'm curious to know how you interpret that score and the sleep stats when you check them. And do you cross check how you feel? What are the actions that you take based on those scores?
yeah. So, like you, sometimes the way I feel when I first wake up doesn't always like correlate to that score that I got. Um, but I've gotten to the point where I really do trust the score, and I can see why is the score. If I get a red recovery score, I look into, well, why was it red? And usually it's some combination of your resting heart rate was higher than usual, your HRV, heart rate variability, was lower than usual, um, and and the way it impacts how I then what I do during the day is, if I'm going to do a workout that day, if I got a red recovery score, I might not push it quite as hard. Or alternatively, if I got a green recovery score and a good night of sleep, then I'll say, you know what, today I can push it extra hard.
Cool.
So that is one of the ways I use kind of the knowledge of my recovery score every morning.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's very scientific and kind of how I feel like the Olympians are doing it. I think you and I have a friend, mutual friend Ryan Murphy, who
Right.
is pretty focused on his Whoop score, and he is one of the most scientific trainers I've ever met.
Awesome to see him using Whoop and getting value out of it.
Yeah, very cool. So kind of going back to college slash right after college, did your identity change at all when you went from, not a startup founder of datesite.com to startup founder and then student athlete to non-student athlete?
Sure, it did. With every change I've made in my life, I think my identity has changed a bit. But one thing I found is like I kept thinking I would stop um, being an athlete. In fact, when I was in high school, I know I mentioned I talked to some of these college coaches, but there was a part of me that wasn't sure if I was even going to run in college.
Hmm.
I was like, I ran in high school, you know, maybe that's it for me. In college, I'll just focus on academics and not do sports. But then I showed up and got into running at Harvard and realized like, hey, this is actually a pretty important part of my college experience, and I'm really glad that I did it and stuck with it. And then after college, I thought, okay, I'm definitely not going to run anymore after college. Like now, I'll just focus on, you know, my career, and I don't need to run anymore. But then I like started running with a group, the BAA in Boston, just kind of on the side. And again, it was kind of nice to um, have that outlet when I was working to just like have kind of like what I was saying in college, like having something else help me balance my work life and having the sport outside of work. Um, so I think I keep thinking I'll give up sport, and then I guess more recent. Well, it's not really recent, but after college, like after several years running after college, my peak was when I ran in the Olympic trials in 2007 in the marathon in Central Park. And after that race, I thought, okay, now I'm really done with running. Like I was in my, how old was I then? 2007. I was like 28 years old. So I was like, okay, it's all downhill from here. There's no point in doing more of this. And I did take some time off because that's when you know, graduated from business school, started a company, went to Facebook, went to Uber, had a decade out in Silicon Valley. So, oh, and got married and started having kids. So I did take kind of this 10-year hiatus from sport, but then I got back into it again. Because I just realized like I really miss it, and I want to see if that's why I got into triathlon. I was like, I'm older now. I'm in my late 30s. I can't just run anymore, but maybe if I add the swimming and cycling, it'll be easier on my joints.
Hmm.
And I kind of surprised myself with like my ability to like come back um, and compete even as I was getting older. So yeah, I guess that's a long answer to your question, but
No,
I
no, it's
kind
great.
of kept coming back to sport at these different points in my life, and um, and it just kind of helped balance things out for me.
Yeah, I bet you most athletes have something pretty similar. And it's definitely like a core part of the identity. It helps balance at the very least, and you need that,
Yeah,
some level of it, at
mhm,
least as a competitive outlet.
totally.
But what about goal setting? How did you set goals in, track or even marathon and triathlon training? And is it similar to how you set goals in business? Don't tell me you have OKRs for triathlons.
I don't call them OKRs, but I mean, I guess there is. I guess the big similarity is I set goals for my athletic performances like relative to how I've done in the past. As I was saying before, it's like
Mm,
I always think like if I did this, I can do even better next time. And in business, it's kind of a similar thing. I whether it was at Facebook or Uber or now Whoop, the first thing we do when we set goals is we look at like, how much did we grow last year? And can we grow as fast or faster this year?
Mm.
Which, by the way, when you're growing, like to even grow at the same rate on a bigger base is challenging and a pretty aggressive goal. So, when I went to Uber to start up the growth team there, that was like the simple way we'd set the top down goal was how fast did we grow last year? Let's try to grow at least that fast next year. And we did that multiple years in a row as we got bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And
And that,
we're doing that at Whoop right now. Like we are growing faster this year than we did last year, and we hope to keep growing as faster. So that's kind of how we set the top down goal. Then we say, okay, now how are we actually going to get there? That's more
right.
of the bottom up, like, okay, these are all the different initiatives we can work on that will help us get to that top down goal. But I like setting the goals top down, because I think it forces you to be really aggressive and kind of have like a different mindset than if you were to like build up to the goals bottom up. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm just trying to think like for my own life, setting goals from the top down. I'm an individual contributor at a company right now as
Yeah.
opposed to leadership.
Yeah.
So I'm my goals are more directive, which I don't like
Okay.
being, an individual athlete.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to figure out like how do individual contributors do that? Or should we just all jump out and be entrepreneurs on our own and use that top level goal setting framework?
Yeah. I mean, good question. I think the goals you set obviously depends on what your role is at a company. And I think as an individual contributor, again, I always like to go back to the relative, like what did I do last year and how can I do better this year? And whatever it
Mm.
is, like if you are a software developer, and maybe you can measure like your productivity, whether that's I don't know if lines of code written is probably not the best way to measure productivity, but if there are ways to measure it and you can like say, okay, here's what I did last year and here's what I'm going to aim to do next year. So, and then, back to the question around how do I set goals around like, sports with the marathon, for example, back when I was trying to get to the trials, there was a pretty clear cutoff time to make the Olympic trials. And back then it was running under 2:22 for the marathon. And the race where I qualified for the trials, I actually had like stomach issues in the middle of that race and had to stop and use a porta potty. And like,
No way.
yeah, I was in the porta potty for a minute or two and I was like, oh man, I don't know if I'm going to make it. But I just started doing the math in my head of like, okay, how fast do I have to go under 2:22? And I ended up running 2:21 and change. Uh, but like having that goal, it forced me to like say, okay, this is what I got to run to get there.
Yeah. And that's that math mind. Another
By the way,
question.
just to clarify, when I said like top down versus bottom up,
Mm.
I guess if I were taking the marathon as an example and what the story I just shared, a top down goal would be like, I have to go under 2:22 and I'm halfway through the race. And so far, I went through the halfway mark at 1:12, right? So then it's like, okay, I've got, uh, I have to go under 70 minutes for the second half. It's that kind of thing versus a bottom up would be more like, okay, I can run like 5:30 pace for the next 13 miles. And then I take 5:30 times 13.1 miles and that's like 72 minutes. But that wouldn't be fast enough, right?
That's
So,
limiting. Yeah.
yeah. So like you kind of, by starting with the top, like what do I have to be at? Then I suddenly tell myself like, oh man, I've got to run like 5:20 pace if I want to have a chance at doing, or, so then it forces you to like, sometimes do things you wouldn't otherwise think you can do.
Yeah. It's like it makes you figure it out.
Yeah.
Necessity is the mother of all learning. What is it? Something like
Right.
that. Okay, cool. How about setbacks though? Because sometimes you will set one of these top down goals and
Yeah.
you'll fail. Or maybe you
All the time.
haven't, but
Yeah, no,
I
no,
have had
no.
that a
I fail
ton.
all the time.
Yeah. So like, how do you deal with that?
I just ask myself, why did I fail? And well, first, I feel I feel bad that I failed. It doesn't feel good to
Yeah,
fail,
you got to feel
right?
the emotions. Yeah.
Yeah, so you feel bad for a while, but then usually, like, I mean, now this depends on, is it like failing at a time I hope to hit in a race, or is it failing at hitting an OKR that I wanted to hit at work?
Hmm.
Um, but I think in both cases, after taking some time to like feel bad about missing the goal, I just find that like gives me more of a drive to like do a better job next time,
Totally.
and to think about like what could I have done differently. Now, a lot of setbacks that are sports related will often have to do with injuries and things like that are somewhat out of my control. But even injuries, like when I look back and think about the times I've gotten injured, especially now that I can like track everything on Whoop, um, it's like there are certain things that can lead to injury, including overtraining, not getting enough sleep, not getting enough, not doing nutrition the right way, and all of that. So I think even things that feel like they were out of your control, like getting injured, actually, if you think about it, like maybe it was more in your control than you realized.
Yeah. So you're looking at the failure points and you're saying, why did this happen? You're analyzing the
Right.
situation. It's like, okay, let's separate out what was out of my control and what's in my control. You get hit by a bus, that's out of your control. What's
Right.
in your control might be overrunning when your Whoop score is below 50. And it's
Right.
like, okay, let's not run when Whoop score is below 50. Let's give it another go.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's awesome. And then in terms of like how often you set goals, I'm assuming at work. I mean, you have to wake up every day and it's like, here are the things I'm doing. How do you manage your time there? Do you look at your goals for the year every day and then say like, how am I going to get there? Or is it like a weekly or quarterly basis where you're just like, okay, I know these are the things that I need to do. Here's how many things I'm going to do on a day-to-day basis. And it's like pretty easy at this point.
Sure. So I like to set kind of a high level North Star goal, for the North Star metric, um, on like a 6 month basis. So
Mm,
where do we want to be by the end of the first half of the year, and where do we want to be by the end of the year? Uh, that's on the growth teams. So at Facebook, our North Star metric back when I was there was monthly active users.
mhm,
So where will we be by the first half of the year? Where will we be by the end of the year? At Uber, it was number of trips. At
mhm,
Whoop, it's number of members. Um, at Uber, it was weekly trips. How many trips are completed per week around the
mm.
world? And so, I feel like setting a goal for kind of 6 months out, but then also showing like this is the trajectory we need to be on to hit that goal. So every week, are we above or below the trajectory we need to be at? Um, and to be able to like look at the start of the week and say like, how did we do last week? Are we ahead or behind, and why? And then every day, we're always looking at like what did we do in the last 24 hours, like, and are we ahead of pace or below pace? So I'd say like it's often a little bit less actionable to look at it's still interesting to look at daily, but I'd say weekly is where you can get a better sense of really like, has the trajectory changed?
Gotcha. So you almost have to set mini weekly goals and then say, is this, this is going to keep us on pace for that 6 month goal. Are we falling behind
Yeah,
or ahead? And what do we need to do
yeah,
the next week? Yeah. Okay. Got it.
exactly. And then if there's a week where you either fall behind or you accelerate more than you thought you would, it's always helpful to like dig into the metrics and understand why,
Cool.
and to learn from it.
A decent amount of people here are going to be thinking, okay, Ed, he had all these amazing opportunities. He's done some incredible stuff, all while balancing family and working out. But where do the entrepreneurial ideas come from? And I know we got to jump off here in a minute. But how do you recommend going about, finding your career's purpose and like coming up with the idea? Or is that the wrong framework? Should it just be where are you in the world? Where do you sit right now? And can you leverage anything that you're close to?
Yeah,
Ridiculous question, I know.
I'll tell you like my perspective on like starting a new company and thinking about like an idea to solve. Now, after having like done it myself a few times, but also seeing other successful entrepreneurs do it. And I feel like um, at the end of the day, like it's it's all about finding like if you feel a pain point and you have a lot of conviction that you know how to solve that pain point, I feel like that's the time to go like build something and potentially turn that into a company versus like I don't know, like at business school, they might teach you like, here are all the ways you can think about, like, if you want to start a new company, all the things you should consider and the frameworks you should use and all that stuff. I don't know. When I look at the most successful entrepreneurs I've worked with, they've they've really just been solving pain points. Like, take Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg, was used to did not like the fact that at Harvard you had this like paper Facebook you'd open up to look for kids in your class, and it had all their old high school photos, and it was kind of pain. It was a pain to like go through and find that person that was in that class with you to try to remember her name or something like that. So he's like, why don't we just put all this online? Um, at the time, I don't think he was thinking it would turn into even a company at all. It was more just solving that pain point. But then one thing led to another, and then it kept getting bigger and working at other colleges, and then more people wanted it. And I think he realized, like, oh, I have to turn this into a company now. Or with Uber, Travis and Garrett, the co-founders of Uber, their pain point was like it was hard to get taxis in San Francisco, especially where Travis lived. It was like hard for him to get taxis. So they're like, why don't we hire a private driver and build an app where we can like press a button and he'll see where to come to pick us up, and we can share this with some of our friends, that kind of thing. So again, it was solving a pain point. I don't think they were thinking it would be any kind of like huge business when they started it. I think that's part of the reason like neither of them initially wanted to be the CEO of Uber, right? They hired someone else to come in and be the CEO. So I think ahead of time you might not know something's going to be big, but if you are solving a pain point, that's a good place to start.
Cool. And then just use all the lessons you learned in athletics, putting your head down, being tactical, setting goals to actually drive home and on the execution part.
Yeah, I think once you have that product market fit, that's the first thing. And that product market hit's not easy to find, and there's a lot of luck involved. And that's part of the reason, I've ended up going to companies that clearly have it, because every time I've tried to find it myself, it's been a struggle. And I'd say like the companies I've started, like to some extent, some have had it and others haven't. So, but yeah, once you have it, then it's all about execution. And then I think there are a lot of analogies between execution on a startup and execution on, hitting your goals as an athlete. It comes down to like every day showing up and putting in the work and just getting a little bit better every single day.
I can't think of a better place to stop the podcast recording. So Ed, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Dave. It was really
All
fun to
right.
chat with you.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Ed Baker. I learned a lot from this. I'm starting to use some of these tips in my everyday life. The focus on pain points, the North Star metrics, the non-comparing to other people, but focusing on bettering yourself. And I hope that you learned something as well. And if you did, share it with somebody, especially if you thought of them during the episode. Please like, share, subscribe, do all those things. I'm on YouTube, Spotify, and you can also go to my website, adavenolan.com, or the beyondthefinishlinepod.com. Press subscribe, follow along the newsletter. I'm looking forward to next week's episode. And by next week, I mean 2 weeks.